Welcome to Body Mind Healing. I'm Diana Lindsay. In this unit, Unit 3, we talk about the starting point of our exploration into healthcare. This might be aspirational, the desire to achieve and maintain optimal health, but for many of us it is a diagnosis that motivates us to pay closer attention. This first video addresses how we are told about our diagnosis and what we believe about our prognosis and our own capacity to heal. In our last video, we looked at the history of medicine from the point of view of the development of medical understanding and treatment over time. But let's look at it briefly as a set of relationships. Through time, we've had understandings of the cause of illness, which has been either outside of ourselves or within. Who does the healing has been either an authority figure, a challenger to that authority figure, or someone within our inner circle. Patients have been viewed as having real diseases or imagined, and what heals, of course, has changed with time. In this next unit, we're going to see how these relationships line up in a very specific way. This is the narrative that Anne Harrington calls the power of suggestion. And in it, the cause of illness is outside of us. What heals us is outside of us. The person who heals us is an authority figure, and the patient has a real illness. But over the course of time, as this narrative has evolved, we see challengers to authority figures, and we see perceptions that the patient was faking it all along. This narrative begins with the concept of possession, a disease theory found in most human cultures. A source outside the body, demons of supernatural origin or a hex or curse by those in the community, takes over the body and causes the illness. What heals is a casting out of the evil force, and the who is someone specifically designated by the society to perform this ritual. In the Catholic Church, this was called a rite of exorcism, and interestingly, these rites weren't revised, and even then not abandoned, until 1999. In general, possession was believed to be a real effect. Patients were genuinely in trouble. But as early as the 16th century, we see experiments that question whether the patient's affliction or possession is real. A priest would sprinkle non-holy water to see if the convulsions stopped. These are the first placebo control experiments. In the 1770s, men of the Enlightenment were looking for ways to diminish the all-powerful priesthood, and a battle took place over the work of a priest called Father Johann Gassner. Gassner was a popular exorcist, the equivalent of our modern-day celebrities. In 1774, the Age of Enlightenment, the medical profession tried to move healing out of the realm of the church to apply scientific ideas to healing the body. And they talked another authority, the Prince of Bavaria, into setting up a commission to investigate and disprove Gassner, which they did. One of the scientists was a man named Austrian physician Franz Mesmer, who was inspired by Newton's ideas of invisible fluids that, like the oceans, responded to planetary gravitation. Mesmer took this a step further. He tried to move mineral magnets around the bodies of his patients in order to manipulate these supposed invisible fluids. And in fact, it seemed to work. His patients reported powerful sensations of energy coursing through their flesh and experienced involuntary movements to the point of violent convulsions. Many were cured or much improved. Next, Mesmer found that he could trigger the same effects simply by waving his hands over the patient. So he assumed that he himself was the source of this healing force, and he called this animal magnetism, a term we still use but in a very different context. I find it interesting that the experience of energy moving through the body is how I would describe Qigong, and the experience of hands impacting that force is what I experience today through Reiki. Mesmer, too, became a personality and a celebrity, and 10 years later he, too, was investigated by a commission who demonstrated that there wasn't an animal magnetic force. A physician named Braid attempted to disprove Mesmer's theories, but found that the phenomenon was real. Patients got better. but the mechanism, invisible fluids, was wrong. His what cures became hypnotism, leading Henry Ellenberger, historian, to note that it's not enough to cure the sick. You have to cure them with methods accepted by the community. In 1884, a physician named Burnham finally introduced the term the power of suggestion to describe the body being impacted by a mind who is influenced by another's suggestion. Today we call this the placebo effect. It got widespread attention after World War II. The story goes like this. Supplies were running low in a field hospital. So a nurse, unable to give morphine to a wounded soldier, gave him instead salt water. The soldier, nevertheless, pain was lowered, and he avoided shock. The man sitting at the end of the table watching the operation, Henry Beecher, could not get the experience out of his mind. He took it home, and he reported on a dozen trials in a paper called The Powerful Placebo, which was published in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1955. He demonstrated that trial volunteers who got real medication were also subject to placebo effects. The act of taking the pill itself was therapeutic and boosted the curative power of the medicine. He even gave it a number, 35% response rate. So he said that only by subtracting the improvement in a placebo control group could you actually determine the value of a drug. Now, his paper caused a sensation. So in 1962, when Congress was reeling from the effects of the tragedy of thalidomide, a drug that had been given to pregnant women causing severe birth defects, Congress put in place the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the beginnings of the FDA. They wanted to establish safety testing, but they also incorporated Beecher's idea and set up placebo control groups. This was the beginning of the double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial that is still the gold standard. In 1957, a dramatic case of the placebo effect was published. It's still referred to today, for example, in the text we're using for this course, Mind Over Medicine. It's the case of Mr. Wright and Dr. Philip West. Mr. Wright had an advanced cancer, a lymphosarcoma. He got well on the placebo arm of a trial called Chrobiacin, but Chrobiacin was not proved effective. And so when Mr. Wright discovered this, he immediately got sick again. His doctor, recognizing how powerful the placebo effect had been for Mr. Wright, gave him a new placebo, and again, Mr. Wright got well. But then when he discovered that that too was a fake, he was so discouraged and immediately died. Since the time of Mr. Wright, there have been hundreds of documented placebo cases. The placebo effect is shown to give pain relief, relaxation, lower cholesterol, increasing your blood cells, as well as mental issues like depression, anxiety. It's improved Parkinson's, even cancer. What is going on? The placebo, in fact, is growing. It's twice as effective in a 2005 antidepressant study than it was in 1980. As a result, drugs that have been on the market for years, such as Prozac, are faltering in recent tests. And a study in 2007 showed that as a result, nearly 50% of Chicago doctors admit to administering ineffective meds in order to generate the placebo response. Steve Silberman in Wired magazine, when he did an article on this, said that the fact that even dummy capsules can kickstart the body's recovery engine became a problem for drug developers to overcome, rather than a phenomenon that could guide doctors towards a better understanding of the healing process and how to drive it most effectively. This focus on triggers has led to our understanding that the placebo effect is generally triggered by our expectations and our belief in medicine and doctors. What's interesting is that our doctors' belief in the efficacy of what they are prescribing can also transmit to us. Studies have also shown that another trigger is our learned condition responses. These vary by culture, but in our culture can come simply from what's in the doctor's office, whether or not the doctor is wearing a white coat, what usually happens to you when you take a medicine. But very recent studies have shown that these can also be completely unconscious cues that can trigger this placebo and what's also known as the nocebo. So the studies show that placebo effects are genuine psychobiological phenomenon attributable to the overall therapeutic context, not only in the lab where we're measuring placebos against medicines that are on trial, but also in clinical. One of the researchers that helped move the placebo effect from a psychological trait related to neurosis and gullibility to a physiological phenomenon, the body's capacity to self-heal, was a man named Dr. Fabrizio Benedetti. He was quoted as saying the placebo effect was considered little more than a nuisance. Drug companies, physicians, and clinicians were not interested in understanding its mechanism. They were concerned only with figuring out whether their drugs worked better. He went on to do studies that showed that the placebo activated opioids in the brain. Here finally was a real mechanism for how the placebo effect worked. Over time, through other studies, scientists have understood that the placebo releases transmitters such as dopamine, which is why Parkinson's patients receive impact. The placebo can change our hormones. The placebo changes the very structure of our brain, and it impacts the systems of the body, from the heart to the respiratory to the immune system. According to Ted Kaptchuk, who studies the placebo effect at Harvard, understanding how placebo effects work clinically in relevant patient populations over time has not kept pace with the recent mechanistic research. But that's starting to change. In 2009, a study sought to understand the placebo effect of a supportive relationship between a healthcare practitioner, in this case an acupuncturist, and a patient. The trial set up 4 different groups. One who received a sham acupuncture ritual, which is you can take a look at this needle. This needle retracted up into that little blue area. The second was the ritual plus a very scripted supportive relationship, which included attention, warmth, confidence, and thoughtful silence, which is interesting. There was another group that had no treatment at all, as well as a control group that had the recommended medication for irritable bowel syndrome. The results were, on the sham acupuncture ritual alone, 44% got adequate relief. With the supportive relationship, that jumped to 62%. No treatment at all was 28%. Interestingly, the control group that had the recommended medication was the equivalent of the supportive relationship. Now, we started this segment talking about the relationship between causes of disease, what heals that disease, who heals it, and who is the patient. These recent studies show the power of the shift in who heals from someone in authority to someone whose effectiveness includes not only knowledge, but their support of the patient. Because it turns out this relationship between the healer and the healed is very important, and it's shifting. The patient, too, has to come up with their side of the bargain and is shifting from passive to active. And this same study that we just looked at gave some indication of how that might work. They found that those patients who were extroverted, agreeable, and open to experienced more placebo responses than those who had had no opportunity to be in relationship and were only in the ritual treatment alone arm. We're going to talk in the next unit more about how patients can contribute through their attitudes to the healing process. Before we do, take time in your journal to think about the last time you were sick. Did your expectations impact the course of an illness? What about your expectations about your healthcare providers, your beliefs around the value that they can give to you? How did that work? And when you've done that, share that in your learning group. And we'll see you in the next unit.